Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to be talking about perfectionism with you all. So today I'm going to talk about perfectionist path to well-being. I'm going to talk about some research aspects, and I'm going to also talk about some practical mental workouts, how to deal with perfectionism. And in this presentation, I will incorporate a collective lens, collective perspective that are common for Asian populations. So my name is Kenneth Wang. I'm currently a psychologist and a professor at Fuller Seminary in Los Angeles or Pasadena, California, and it's my honor to present on this topic. So for today, what I'll do is I'll start with a presentation about what is perfectionism. And then after giving you a sense of the basic framework of perfectionism, then I will talk about the research background. I will share some of the research studies that I've done, and then we will move into more of the clinical aspects. How do we understand perfectionists? How do perfectionists think? And then how can we help perfectionists? Whether you're a perfectionist yourself, you want to learn some tips on how to help yourself, or whether you work with perfectionist clients that you can help them, or perfectionist students that you can help them. So this will be the main outline for my study, for my presentation today. So let's start with what is perfectionism. I'm a visual person, so I like images. So I'm going to start with some images that demonstrates what perfectionism is. So in this first one, you can see that perfectionists, they tend to have extremely high standards. So it's not enough to be good. They have to be excellent. They have to be outstanding. They have to be the top. That's one of the characteristics of perfectionists. They have very high standards and they strive to achieve those standards. In addition, perfectionists are often very self-critical. They can look at their own mistakes and feel very angry, feeling mad at themselves. I love this picture of someone like very angry, banging on. Maybe they made a mistake or maybe they're not good enough, but this is self-critical is another aspect of perfectionism. Another one is perfectionists. They often tend to be very precise and very organized. So they like order. It's hard for them when things are messy, when things are not predictable, when things are not precise. And another characteristics of perfectionists are perfectionists, they tend to be afraid of making mistakes or afraid of failure. So in this example, like they focus a lot on defense, they protect themselves, but they don't focus as much on offense in terms of attacking. So I don't know if you're a sports fan or not. So for example, if you're a soccer fan or a football fan, a perfectionist are like they focus on defense so that the other team will not score, but they don't invest or take as much risk in terms of offense, in terms of trying to score, because they don't want to make any mistakes. So that's another characteristic of perfectionists. And for some perfectionists, they have a focus on wanting the perfect process. They focus on efficiency. They feel like from the start to the end needs to be linear, straightforward, and they get it done at in the first try. And it's hard for them to, deal with all the setbacks, all the challenges, and the curvy path between the start and the end. So those who can deal with the curvy path and the different setbacks, those are the ones who have resilience. So in other words, some perfectionists, they lack the resilience in terms of dealing with the messiness, dealing with the setbacks, dealing with the failures, dealing with the do-overs in terms of for a process. Another characteristic of perfectionists are that they often procrastinate. So they delay certain things because they have such a high standard. It feels like this mountain that's very high. The task that I must undertake is towering over me like a great big monolith, like a big mountain, and then it's too high and it's too big. So then they think, I will just go and have a little look at the internet. So instead of trying to tackle um, a very high standard, high task, they procrastinate and do something else. They go to the internet, they go play on their phone or do other things. And people with perfectionism often feel deflated, often feel like very discouraged when they make a mistake or when they encounter a failure. This little boy is really cute, but we can see that it's very discouraging when he fails, like when encountering a mistake or a failure. Another aspect or characteristic of perfectionism is that they have all or nothing thinking. So here, there's two pictures. One is perfection, so this one on the right, and the other is imperfect. I don't know. Based off of you, I wonder if you can tell the difference between these two. It's probably really hard. I think most people can't. But I'll give you a few seconds to kind of examine and see if you have a really good eye on detail and see what's imperfect about one of them. So here's a dot where maybe they were chasing and they accidentally made a little mistake. And I think for really extreme perfectionists, they'll feel like they can't tolerate this little mistake. And then they would probably have to tear it up and redo the image. So perfectionists are like that. It's either all or nothing. A little imperfection is nothing, and they need to redo it. And again, perfectionists, some they need to seek the perfect solution, the perfect option, the perfect choice. So perfectionists can often be very indecisive, whether it's big things like, do I marry this person or not? Or shopping, which cell phone do I get? They can go back and forth. And even I had one perfectionist client. She had IVF, so she was trying to have a baby. And so they had different options. So it was, I don't IVF. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term, but it's the technique that helps people who can't easily get pregnant. So they had the option of choosing a boy versus a girl to implant in their body. So my client was so indecisive. We talked for months about wanting a boy or wanting a girl. And then finally, at the timeline, the deadline that she had to decide the night before the implant, she decided a girl. And then they, and then, but the next morning when they woke up, she was like, regret, and then said, oh, I think I want a boy. And then they called the hospital and stuff, and they said it's too late. We already defrost one of the eggs, and then it's the girl. And then even after the baby was in her stomach, she went back and forth and felt regret. So there's a lot of indecisiveness, scrutinizing every pro and con of each decision. So it can be very challenging for people who are extremely perfectionist and feel like there's a perfect decision in everything, and they want to make sure they decide and make the perfect decision. Next, I'll talk about the framework based off of research. Perfectionist has different dimensions. So perfectionism is not just one dimensional, but it has different aspects, positive and negative aspects. So perfectionism is a personality, is a construct. And types of perfectionists are different types of people. So these are two different ways to look at perfectionism. So a while back, maybe around 10 years ago, me and my research team, we were curious about how many perfectionism measures are out there. And so what we did was we did a literature review. I think there was about 20, 30 measures at that time. I think now there's probably more. And then we put in the subscales of each measure and made a word cloud based off of the subscales. And so here we can see the larger words are the ones that appear more often. So like standards, having high standards. I think there was a parenting related perfectionism scale. So they had a lot of parenting subscales. So it seems like when people research perfectionism, parenting is an aspect that they look at. And here we can see mistakes, order, organization, performance, self-oriented, etc. So more systematically, these are how perfectionism have been looked at in terms of different dimensions based on the variable level, based on the construct of perfectionism. So there's positive aspect of perfectionism and there's negative aspects of perfectionism. A positive aspect is having high standards, setting very high bars to achieve. And another positive aspect is being orderly and being very organized. That's a positive characteristic. And on the other hand, there are negative aspects of perfectionism. So one is discrepancy. So discrepancy is the gap between your goals or your standard and your actual performance. So that's the gap. That's the discrepancy, and or the imperfect part. And then another one is concern over mistakes. If you make a mistake, you're very bothered by it. And another one is doubts about action. Like it's hard to take action because you think so much and you have doubts after you take the action, like the client that I mentioned who was deciding between a boy and a girl. So that's one way to look at perfectionism, positive and negative. So positive means that they're more related to positive aspects of well-being, and negative means that they're more related to anxiety, depression, etc. And another way to look at perfectionism dimensions is to look at where is perfectionism coming from and who is it directly directed towards. So we have the self-oriented perfectionism here. So it's perfectionistic standards and perfectionistic criticalness directed towards oneself. This is a common concept of perfectionism as a personality trait. And then there's another one, and it's the other-oriented perfectionism. So it's perfectionism directed towards another person. So a common example is perfectionism directed towards a significant others, a person's boyfriend, girlfriend, person's spouse, or it could be directed towards your employees or your students. Like there's perfectionistic boss, perfectionistic teachers that are very critical towards their students, and like Steve Jobs, who invented the iPhone. So he was known as a perfectionist that was very perfectionistic towards others. He could drive people crazy, and people didn't really like working with him. But of course, he made perfect products in terms of the iPhone. And then another aspect of perfectionism is socially prescribed perfectionism. So it's perceived expectations from the outside directed towards me. So it could be like I perceive my family expecting perfectionism, or it could be like I perceive my work culture, my boss having perfectionistic expectations towards me. And for people who are religious, it could be perceiving that God it has perfectionistic expectations on them. So that's a different, another dimension of perfectionism. And what we'll do next is we will look at one of the perfectionism measures. It's called the almost perfect scale revised. So this is the measure that my advisor, Dr. Bob Langley, developed. So I thought it was a very interesting measure, and I really thought it had a clever name, the almost perfect scale revised. So it has some perfectionism mentality. So it's never perfect, because for perfectionists, their standards just keep going up, 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 up. So it's never perfect. So it's the almost perfect scale. But then after it's published, oh, we have to revise it again. So I think it has a really good way of demonstrating perfectionism. And so what I will have you do now is there is a link here, and then I'm going to copy this link, and then let me see, oops. And I'm going to copy this link to share with you, the participants here, but also for people online. You can access the link, and I would encourage you to pause for 5-10 minutes and then go online and complete the Korean version of the almost perfect scale. And after you complete that version, you will receive your scores. Okay, so at this time, I'll let you go online and take this measure. And when you take a look at it, you'll see there's a Korean version. And then afterwards, it will give you a score. And then based on the score, write it down, and then I'll interpret the outcomes later. So I'll give you a few minutes, take your time, do it. And then after everyone's done, let me know, and then we'll move on. I hope the translation is done well. It was done by a Korean professor, the almost perfect scale. It has 23 items, and we also have a Korean version there. So make sure you go to the top right corner, and you can select Korean if you desire to answer it in Korean. And then after you answer it, on the last page, it'll give you scores for the different dimensions. And then make sure you write it down before you hit submit. And then afterwards, I will talk about how to interpret the results. Okay, so I'll let you do the measure. And after that, you can continue to follow along. So before I go into your individual results, I'm going to give you an understanding of perfectionism based on the almost perfect scale perspective. So when Bob Langley was developing the perfectionism scale, there were already two multidimensional perfectionism scale available. One was developed by Frost and other co-authors, and the other one was Hewitt and Flett. So the Frost one had different dimensions: personal standards, parental expectations, parental criticism, doubts about actions, concern over mistakes, etc. And then the Hewitt and Flett one, it had self-oriented perfectionism, other-oriented perfectionism, and a perceived perfectionism that are imposed on themselves. So they had different ways of measuring perfectionism. And when Langley wanted to develop this scale, he thought it would be important to measure the core essence of what is perfectionism, as opposed to perfectionism's impact or behaviors. So, for example, doubts about action, that's more like an impact of perfectionism as opposed to perfectionism itself. And in other words, parental criticism is more like a cause of perfectionism as opposed to perfectionism itself. So what Langley and colleagues, what they did was they went into the dictionary to look at the definition of perfectionism. So they identified two key aspects of perfectionism based on the dictionary. One aspect is extreme or excessive striving for perfection. So that was one aspect. So striving for perfection, having high standards. And the other aspect was a disposition to regard anything short of perfection as unacceptable. So it's focusing on the imperfection, and any imperfection felt like it was unacceptable. So that's another aspect of perfectionism. So based on these two definitions, they developed the standard scale. So it measures the level of standards one sets for their performance. And then for the other part, they developed the discrepancy subscale. And it's the perceived difference between the standard one has set for one's own behavior and the actual performance. So it's the focus on imperfection and then being bothered by imperfection. So standards and discrepancy are the two main dimensions based on the almost perfect scale. But there's also an order scale. And so order is a tendency to value a sense of order and organization. And the reason they add this is because they did clinical interviews, interviewed many perfectionists. And through their interviews, they feel like there was also another aspect of perfectionism. Perfectionist was they are very orderly and they like organization. So then they added this subscale. So there's 3 subscales for the almost perfect scale. However, the order is not as core in terms of compared to standards and discrepancy. So when I talk about in the following, when we classify people into different types of perfectionists, we don't need to use order. We'll use standards and discrepancy. I'll talk more about that later. So this is the almost perfect scale. I kind of mentioned there's 3 subscales: standards, order, and discrepancy. And based on those subscales, we can classify people into different types of perfectionists. So 1978, this was way back before all the perfectionism scales were measured or were developed. Hamachek, so he's a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist. So he observed and he wrote an article saying that there's different types of perfectionists. So one is the normal perfectionist or the healthy perfectionist, and the other is a neurotic perfectionist that are unhealthy, that are maladaptive. So what's the difference between the 2 of them? So for the more normal perfectionist, striving, having high standards, working hard for it, it brings a sense of satisfaction. So they're very driven and they focus on doing things right. However, they're relaxed, but they're careful and they have a strong desire to improve. So they want to achieve high standards. They want to achieve perfectionism. And in contrast, there's the neurotic perfectionism. Of course, they still have unrealistic expectations, high standards, but they never think that their effort is good enough. So they're always very critical, looking at the parts that they're inadequate or not hardworking enough. And they're very concerned about making mistakes. So they put in a lot of effort to avoid doing things wrong. So they're very tensed and very deliberate, and they're very afraid of failure. So these are 2 different types of perfectionists. And the almost perfect scale has been the measure that are most commonly used to classify people into the different types of perfectionists. So based on this scale, and using cluster analysis or latent profile analysis, they found most common 3 different types. One is adaptive, healthy perfectionist. Another is maladaptive perfectionist, the unhealthy ones. And then, of course, there's people who are not perfectionists. So the perfectionists, they have high standards, and the non-perfectionists have low standards. And then to differentiate adaptive perfectionists from maladaptive perfectionists, the adaptive perfectionists do not have discrepancy, and the maladaptive perfectionist has high discrepancy. Does that make sense? And of course, non-perfectionists, they typically have low standards and low discrepancy. So this is how you classify people into healthy, adaptive perfectionists versus non-perfectionists and maladaptive perfectionists. So if I use a visual to explain, so perfectionists are those who have a big glass. They want to contain a lot of water, so they have high expectations. And in contrast to non-perfectionists, they have a relatively smaller glass. They don't need to contain that much water. And then among the perfectionists, the maladaptive perfectionists are always looking at the proportion of the glass that's empty. So they focus on the half empty of the glass. So I'll pause for a few seconds and then let you think, are you a perfectionist? I don't know if you want to give yourself a guess or not. Think about it. And also, if so, what kind of perfectionist do you think you are? Are you adaptive or are you maladaptive? So you can think, give yourself a guess, and then later on, I will kind of try to explain. I will explain how to interpret results. Okay, So you just did the almost perfect scale. So you have your scores. So among those scores, you have a standard score and a discrepancy score. But before I interpret, I want to let you know that the cutoff scores are normed among college students in the US. So in using the English version. So there's slight differences, but just for the sake of to give you an idea, I'll share the cutoff scores with you. But don't feel like you're labeled. Oh, I'm this or that. It's not 100% accurate. I wouldn't use it as a diagnosis, but it's just a rough idea. So based on the American college students, if your standard score is 42 or above, that means that you're a perfectionist. Okay, so now you know if you're a perfectionist or not. If you have 42, 43 or more, you're a perfectionist. If you're lower than that, you're not a perfectionist. Okay, and then if you're a perfectionist, if your discrepancy score is above 42, 42, 43, 44, or above, you're a maladaptive perfectionist. You're more like the unhealthy type of perfectionist that can often focus on your inadequacies and you're bothered by imperfection. However, if your discrepancy score is less than 42, it's 41, 40 or lower, then you're a healthy adaptive perfectionist. So that kind of gives you a sense of the type of perfectionist you are. So, but of course, it's not 100% accurate. It's based off of college students in the US using the English version measure. But just for the fun or give you some idea, just wanted to give you the cutoff scores. So you kind of get a sense of where you're at. But more importantly, the important part is to know that the adaptive, the standard is healthy, but the discrepancy part is unhealthy. Okay. So next, what I will do is, in addition to the standards discrepancy, the adaptive, maladaptive aspects of perfectionism, there's also the directionality. We talked about the self-oriented perfectionism, the other-oriented perfectionism, and the socially prescribed perfectionism. So that's a 2 by 3 dimensions. But perfectionism can come in different domains. So for some people, they're perfectionists across in general in most domains. But for some others, they're perfectionistic in certain aspects, but not others. So for example, if someone's very perfectionistic in physical appearance, in their body weight, in how they look, they might be someone who's dealing with eating disorders. If that could be an issue if they go to the extreme in terms of caring about how they look, of course, or caring a lot about how they eat, calculating a lot of the calories or how they exercise. That could also be an issue. And some people, if they are very perfectionistic about social relationships and feel like they need to please everyone, they need to have everyone like them, and often are very critical about how they perform in their interaction with others, then they can turn into more like social anxiety. And of course, if they're very perfectionistic in certain order, they could be like OCD, being like more obsessive compulsive disorder. So perfectionism can come in different domains. So maybe for some people, you have high perfection in your work, but for chores and cleanliness, you don't have perfectionism. So you can also think about which aspect do you have perfectionism in versus others. Okay, another part that I want to introduce is causes of perfectionism. So some people might ask, why are some people perfectionists and why are some people not? Where does it come from? Is it biological or is it environmental or how is it related to one's personality? So first of all, a lot of research have done studies on how perfectionism is related to external factors. So most commonly, research has looked at parental expectations and criticisms. So for people who come from families that have high expectations or come from families that are very critical, they can tend to develop perfectionism. And sometimes I encounter clients and they don't really have very critical parents, or the parents might not give explicit messages about expectations. However, their parents might be perfectionists themselves. So they're very critical of themselves, or they have very high standards. They talk about it for themselves, and then the children model that. They learn that, pick up those perfectionism tendencies from their parents. Another external factor is societal and cultural pressure. So some societies, people tend to research, see that Asian cultures, Asian people, East Asians in particular, have higher levels of perfectionism. So it could be related to what certain cultures and society emphasize. So at least for my example, growing up in Taiwan, with the influence of Confucius or Chinese culture, there's a lot of times focusing on the aspects that you're not good enough and how to improve. And so, for example, if you go and take an exam and you get 98 points, you come home and the parent said, "Oh, you missed those 2 points." And then we learned to look at the aspects where we're not good enough. So societal, cultural pressure can have an impact, and also the settings can have an impact. I know that in Korea, in Taiwan, education is pretty competitive, and we take exams. We want to get into good colleges, and we go to cram school, study late, and growing up, like our grades were made public, who's number one, who's number two. And so it's a very competitive environment. And like a few points could drop from one school to another. So in those kind of education or work settings, it can also facilitate people to become perfectionists because they're competing against others, and then they need to be very attentive to having the high standards or very critical of where I need to improve. So those are some of the external factors. And in addition, there's also personality factors. So these are the personality factors. Some are part of the big five, and then also one is the obsessive compulsive one. And so people who are conscientious, they focus a lot on achievement. They're very self-disciplined. Those are related to perfectionism. Also, people who are very agreeable, they tend to be people pleasers. They want to do things to satisfy others, to be liked. That's related to perfectionism. And also people who have neuroticism. They tend to be anxious, they tend to have self-doubt, and they tend to be insecure. And that sort of can drive them to perform and to try to achieve perfection because they feel like if there's imperfection, others will see through them and they feel insecure. And of course, in the DSM-4, there's the obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So it's different from the OCD like person disorder. It's the personality type that focuses a lot on control, focuses a lot on neatness, order. So that's also related to perfectionism. So I would say among the DSM personalities, obsessive compulsive personality disorder oftentimes is pretty much describes people who are perfectionists. And then lastly, sometimes people ask, is perfectionist inherited from your genes, from your parents? So there was a study that studied identical twins versus non-identical twins. And then they found that the perfectionism aspect, two aspects, one is the personal standards, and the other aspect is the concern over mistakes. Those two aspects, as part of the Frost perfectionism measure, are genetically determined. So they're more associated with one's genes. So we can say the cause of perfectionism is a combination between genetics, external factors, the environment, and also it's related to our personality. I'm going to talk about some research background. on perfectionism. So I'm just going to highlight a few research studies, mostly what I have done. Of course, it's not an exhaustive review of the whole literature, but I'll start with the basic research progression of perfectionism. So perfectionism's research kind of started around 1990. So that was when perfectionism as a multidimensional construct was developed. So that was when the two most common measures, they're both called multidimensional perfectionism scale. Both scales were developed around 1990s, and they found how perfectionism is linked with depression, anxiety, eating disorder, etc. And then about the next decade, around the 2000s, that's when they started to categorize people, mostly using the almost perfect scale, into different types of perfectionists. So not only look at the construct of the personality, but looking at people, different types of people, adaptive perfectionists versus maladaptive perfectionists versus non-perfectionists. And then later on, around the mid 2000s, um, studies start to examine perfectionism among different populations, not only in the US, Western cultures, but international groups. They looked at athletes, certain populations that perfectionism was more prevalent in. And then later on, around 2010, there were some intervention studies with experimental designs that came out to examine perfectionism. And then more so, more recent, starting 2015, and then also now there's a lot more meta-analysis on different topics of perfectionism, interventions, different aspects associated with perfectionism, like eating disorder, depression, pathology, narcissism, etc. So this is the general timeline of perfectionism literature. So another topic that I want to introduce is perfectionism over time. So based off of this meta-analysis conducted in 2017, they found that perfectionism has been increasing over time. So they looked at analysis of birth cohort differences from 1989 to 2016. So here we can see three dimensions of perfectionism: the self-oriented perfectionism, perfectionism towards myself. There's some slight increase over the years. Socially prescribed perfectionism, like I feel like other people expect me to be a perfectionist. We can see a steeper increase here. And then other oriented perfectionism, that I have perfectionistic expectations towards others. There's also an increase there. So based on this, they found like over the last 27 years, they studied 164 samples with over 40,000 American, Canadian, and British college students who completed the multidimensional perfectionism scale developed by Hewitt and Flett. And they found that all the three levels of perfectionism have been increasing over time. So so younger generations, perfectionism is becoming more prevalent and there's more demands. And also, I can also see that in terms of base of the information that we have now available versus 20, 30 years ago. So for example, we have social media now. So we have access to know who's doing what in all the different activities of people's different life. And then if we start to compare ourselves with that, we can feel pretty bad, and our standards can increase a lot. So that's one aspect. And another aspect related to the most like to dating, finding a partner is different nowadays versus 20, 30 years ago. Based on 20, 30 years ago, you just select someone that you encounter in your own social setting. But after the dating apps came out, you had access to people not only in your social in-person interactions or at work, but also you had access to anyone online and even different places across the world. So it could also facilitate that perfectionism, and people are uncertain of, is this the perfect partner or is the better partner out there? So the more information the more choices that we have, I think that facilitates perfectionistic tendencies. So I want to give you a little bit background of what perfectionism is related to in terms of the different mental health aspects. So perfectionism is often related to anxiety, like we said, needing to achieve, feeling insecure. Perfectionism can be related to depression. Some people who strive to be perfection, that strive for perfection, when they don't achieve it, they have that all or nothing feeling, and the failure can feel very devastating. And there's been studies that has been conducted on perfectionism and suicidal ideation. Perfectionism is often related to eating disorder when it's manifested in their physical appearances. Perfectionism can be related to OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Of course, perfectionism is related to self-esteem, related to performance, related to a person's relationship, and also substance abuse, um, using alcohol, using drug to numb the negative emotions can be a coping mechanism for perfectionists, which is unhealthy. Okay, giving you a sense of the broad literature, I'm just going to highlight a few perfectionism studies that I've conducted in my research journey. So for me, I think I started to look at the collectivistic aspect of perfectionism. So early on, when I started grad school, perfectionism was more focused on the Western world with a more individual value perspective. And so I wanted to use a collective lens to look at perfectionism. And in turn, I developed the idea of family perfectionism. So perfectionism is beyond just an individual personality, but it becomes like a family thing because in collectivistic cultures, family has a large impact on how we feel about ourselves. If we come from families that are perfectionists, it shapes who we are. It impacts our stress level. It impacts our well-being and how we perceive our own self-worth. So did some cultural examinations, looking at culture. And then later on, I also did some perfectionism on the religious aspect, which was also an aspect of the perfectionism literature that was relatively light. There was a gap in the research aspect. So I'll talk about perfectionism, how it moved to family perfectionism, and then some of the expansions and implications. So I'm going to start with one study, in terms of family perfectionism and how that idea came across in terms of my research with Chinese or Taiwanese populations. So for Chinese cultural populations, which Taiwan is also impacted by, it's based off of a collectivistic culture. And in this collectivistic culture, family is highly valued. So in Chinese, there's a saying that's called 百善孝为先. That means the family familial piety, like respecting the elders, respecting your parents, taking care of your parents. That's one of the most important values in the Chinese culture. And then there's another aspect that's commonly, prevalently focused on in the Chinese culture, and that's losing face. That's we care a lot about the impression that we give people, and then especially when we're a family as a unit, we try to tell kids like, oh, if you do this bad thing, you'll embarrass the family. But if you go into this good school, you will bring honor to the family. So a lot of pressure is put on the children in terms of bringing honor or shame to the family. And a lot of times, family use shaming, pointing out the aspects that they're not good enough as a way to train and socialize their children. So that's similar to the concept of discrepancy, like where you're not good enough, point that out so that you can improve. So Dr. Guo Suyang is a professor that started the Chinese indigenous psychology movement. So he was someone who I worked with as a research assistant before I started my doctoral studies. So I was really impacted by him because his view was we have been impacted by the white Western research psychology. But different people, different culture, the psychology is different. And we need to go back to our own roots and use indigenous studies to understand the people of a certain culture. So he developed a model called this Chinese social orientation model that describes Chinese personality, in addition to the individualistic psychology that has been studied a lot in the Western world. So, in this Chinese social orientation model, he mentioned four different orientations. So, the familistic orientation, valuing the family, seeing the family as a unit, the relationship orientation that values or puts a lot of emphasis on your relationship with others and relationship capital, etc. And then there's the authoritarian orientation that we respect people, experts with authority, the elders, or sometimes when we're in a room, we kind of sense who has which status, and then we behave accordingly, like how we bow, how we address certain people. That's also emphasized in the Chinese culture, and I think some might also be similar in the Korean culture. And then there's also a other orientation that we often focus on this imaginary other. Like, oh, if I do this, I will lose faith. It's not losing faith to a particular person, but it's just the other outside world. So these were the four Chinese social orientation aspects that Dr. Yang had proposed. And for me, I focused on the familistic orientation. I wanted to look at how perfectionism is related in the family aspect. So what I did was I modified the almost perfect scale into a family-oriented perfectionism scale. So the standards were no longer just my standards for myself, but looking at my family's standards for me, like whether my family had perfectionistic high standards of me. And then order was whether my family expected me to be an orderly person, whether neatness was important to my family. And then also discrepancy, whether I felt like I lived up to my family standard, or whether I felt like I was often inadequate, often falling short of their expectations. So these were the three dimensions of family perfectionism. So, in other words, I don't know if you ever heard of the tiger mom term. So, this was an American professor, I think she taught at Yale, Amy Chua. And then she wrote a book called The Tiger Mom, describing how she parented her two kids, I think, who eventually went to Ivy League schools. She was very harsh, very perfectionistic, like a tiger mom, had high expectations, very critical. The book was called Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom, and demanding the Eastern method um, in contrast to the more permissive Western method of parenting. So she forced her kids to practice Chinese, math, instruments, even on weekends, very different from other American families. And she even threatened to throw away all her daughter's dolls if she couldn't play a certain song. I know this sounds very crazy to Americans, but to me, I'm like, yeah, a lot of Asians are like this. Parents make threats and say very mean things, and they care a lot about children's performance. And then she had extremely high expectations, not only on her children, but on her as well. So this is like an example of family perfectionism to the extreme. So I developed the family perfectionism scale. And then in the initial study where I developed the scale, I measured it across Asian Americans in the US. Some were international students, some were Asian Americans who were born in the US, against white European Americans. So based off the study, I found that Asian Americans and Asians in the US, they reported higher personal discrepancy, family discrepancy, and family order than European Americans. So here we can see the discrepancy part. Asians are higher. They often feel like they're not good enough. They focus more on their imperfection, and also they feel like their family thinks that they're not good enough. However, in terms of personal standards and family standards, there were no difference in terms of how they responded to the level of standards they perceived from their family. And what we also did was we did a cluster analysis and looked at different types of families. So the adaptive perfectionistic families were families with high standards but low discrepancy. The maladaptive perfectionistic families were families that were having high standards and also kids feeling like their family, they don't live up to their family standards. They're not good enough. Their family is critical. And so the maladaptive perfectionistic family, we see that Asian Americans had 28% in comparison to 19% for the white European Americans. There was a higher percentage of Asian Americans perceiving coming from a more Tiger Mom maladaptive perfectionistic family. Okay, the study initially started off in Taiwan because I did a study and was wondering how much of perfectionism comes from the family, and then eventually did it in the U.S. and then in China, and then different places, the India, where the family almost perfect skill got translated. And you can see, I think certain cultures like Italy, they're a Western country, but they're more collectivistic compared to maybe British, France, Germany. So they translated the almost perfect scale, and also Russia. Russia is a relatively collective country compared to other European countries. So here we can see some of the countries that and cultures that were more interested in the family aspect of perfectionism. That the almost perfect scale has been translated into various versions in the family. So I'm going to just highlight a few other studies. So family perfectionism and suicidal ideation. So I think suicidal ideation is one of the more serious issues for mental health. And so Joyner had proposed a model, an interpersonal model of suicidal ideation. So in this model, he said there's two interpersonal aspects that are most related or that are high risk for suicidal ideation. One was thwarted belongingness. It feels like I feel like I no longer belong. I no longer belong to my family, no longer belong to people who are close to me in my social setting. So their belongingness they've lost that sense of belongingness. So that's one interpersonal risk of suicidal ideation. And another interpersonal risk of suicidal ideation is perceived burdensomeness. So they perceive that they're a burden to others. So I don't belong and I'm a burden to them. So maybe I should end my life so I won't be a burden to others. So these are two interpersonal risk factors for suicidal ideation. So we did a study with international students, and here we saw that family perfectionism was a moderator of perceived burdensomeness and suicidal ideation. So in this example, like if you have high family discrepancy, you feel like you're never good enough in your family's eyes, the link between perceived burdensomeness and suicidal ideation is stronger than if you had lower family discrepancy. So in other words, like perceiving that you're not good enough in your family's eyes can exacerbate, can make it more serious in terms of how these interpersonal suicidal risk can lead to suicidal ideation. That was the same for thwarted belongingness as well. So family discrepancy is a risk factor for one's mental health. So just to summarize a few of our studies. So the first one, Asian and Asian American students tend to have higher discrepancy both family and personal. And the family almost perfect scale was psychometrically evaluated in various groups. And we were able to identify 3 parallel groups of perfectionistic family types: adaptive, maladaptive, and non-perfectionist. And family discrepancy poses a risk for suicidal ideation. Okay, so in summary, how do we treat differently in terms of adaptive and maladaptive perfectionism? So now we know the discrepancy, the maladaptive perfectionism, not only individual, but also family discrepancy, is a risk to mental health. So the main thing is that the goal is to lower discrepancy. The standards are fine. They're adaptive, they're okay. They're related to self-esteem. Standards are also related to achievement, and they're not related to anxiety or depression. So we shouldn't need to worry about the standards, but the goal should be lowering this discrepancy. And how do we lower the discrepancy? So people with high discrepancy, they're very bothered by imperfection. What we would want to do is help people to accept imperfection and then also be aware of their criticalness. So when they're really critical to them, being aware of that and allowing them to accept imperfection and to be able to tolerate the negative emotions related to imperfection and the criticalness. So those are the ways to deal with maladaptive perfectionism. Next, I'll present a few studies related to religion. So one is perfectionism, scrupulosity, and well-being. So scrupulosity, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the word, but scrupulosity is related to religion. It's a religious obsessive compulsive fear of sinning and being punished by God. So this study was with Mormons, with Latter-day Saints. So what we did was we looked at how perfectionism, the maladaptive discrepancy, people who had perfectionism tend to have higher scrupulosity. They scrutinize themselves. They're always fearful of sinning, always fearful of being punished by God, and just so careful to obsessive compulsive aspect, and therefore leading to lower life satisfaction, higher depression, and higher anxiety. So the perfectionism do impact in the religious realm. And what we also did was we looked at the different types of perfectionists. And here we can see the orange are the maladaptive perfectionists who has high discrepancy. They have the highest scrupulosity. And however, the adaptive perfectionists, the blue ones, they have the highest intra and inter commitment. So they're mostly religious, more religious committed than the other groups. However, their scrupulosity is not as high. So these are the different types of religious folks in terms of their perfectionist types. Another example also with the Mormons in a different sample, we looked at legalism, scrupulosity, and family perfectionism. What we found was legalism. Legalism is feeling like I need to behave a certain way for me to gain God's approval. That's related to scrupulosity, and in turn have higher shame and guilt. So there's mediation between legalism and shame and guilt through scrupulosity. And family discrepancy intensified the link between scrupulosity and shame and guilt. So in other words, if you have higher family discrepancy, so this is feeling like you're not good enough in your family's eyes, in this religious realm, among the Mormons, the link between scrupulosity that leading to shame and guilt is stronger. Another example of the importance of understanding family discrepancy and how that relates to shame and guilt with religious individuals. Later on, also with Mormons, though I had a collaborator who was at Brigham Young University, so we collected data, and then we developed another scale called perfectionism from God scale. So looking at standards from God. God has high expectations of me. God expects the best from me. or discrepancy from God, feeling like God is judgmental, God is not satisfied, my best is never good enough for God. So that's another measure, parallel to the family perfectionism, but more in the religious realm, from God. In addition to measuring the levels of perfectionism, we did another aspect. We were curious in terms of this Mormon population. What does it mean to be perfect in God's eyes? So, in other words, it's like the domain, that different domains of perfectionism that we talked about, cleanliness, body image, etc. We wonder for people, these Mormons, what is being perfect? And then we realize different people have ideas of what being perfect is. So, in other words, they're striving for different things. So, for example, some people said being perfect was being like godlike, and other people said achieving the perfect in the religious realm is impossible. It's through atonement. It requires the intervention of the death of Jesus Christ. And there are some people that says, oh, perfect is about trying. It's just doing your best. You don't have to achieve certain things. Some people said being perfect is about being other focused. It's about other centered, being loving, being selfless, being forgiving, being charitable. There's also people that said a perfect believer is having good virtues. It's not related to interaction with others, but more like you just inner attitude, or you have certain positive characteristics. Some people talked about being perfect is not sinning, is being fully obedient. There's people who said that being a perfect Mormon, being a perfect believer, is having pure intentions, having the right pure desires. It's not about the behavior, but the inner desires. There are certain people that focus on the spiritual practices and activities, attending churches, praying, etc. And there's also a group of people that said being a perfect believer is about repentance, about improvement. So this is how it came out. So 56%, over half, said trying your best is what believer is defined as. And then half of them said that obey, not sinning is, and then repenting and improving included 40%. Here we can see different people have different ideas. In addition to Mormons, we also later did a study that examined Buddhists, Muslims, and Christians in China. I won't report that here. It's another published study. We looked at what their perception of a perfect believer is. So we think it is important to not only quantitatively measure the level, but to also understand what it means to be perfect from religious people. We asked the question, and then people wrote out a statement of their definition of a perfect believer. And then so we had those 9 categories. And then here we can see that there the certain number of people. So the majority of people in their responses, it included aspects of 3 different themes. And then there's some that included 4 different themes, some 2 different themes, and very few that included many different themes. And of course, some that only had 1 theme in their description. So it's a sophisticated matter. Perfectionism is not just a high and low. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to talk about, guide you into the minds of perfectionists. I'm going to also talk about different interventions, how to help people who have perfectionism. You can use it on yourself if you identify as having some perfectionistic tendencies, or you can use it to help your clients, your students, or others. Okay, I'm gonna show you a series of images based on their facial expression. So this little kid worked hard. The perfectionists, they think the harder people work, the better they will do. So they focus a lot on outworking others, working extremely hard, spending more time. This little kid, focus. So perfectionists, they think in order to get ahead, you have to be very focused on the thing that you want. You can give up all outside interest. So people who are perfectionists, they probably don't have work-life balance. They're just extremely focused on their work so that they can achieve and perform well. So there's this different type of perfectionists. They don't work hard, but they think clever people do not need to work as much as stupid people. So some perfectionists think they want to be seen as clever. So for them, they want to be able to achieve well without working too hard. And or else they feel like I'm just a hard worker. They focus on being clever and not having to work. So some perfectionists, they're very different than the hardworking ones. Okay, another mindset is nonstop working. So if I know I can do better or more and do not pursue, that means I'm lazy. So you keep doing, keep doing, keep doing. So for example, if you have a report due on Saturday, you probably have a first draft done by Wednesday, but Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, you keep on doing. Sometimes, as long as you have time, you just feel like you have to keep on doing, or you feel like you're lazy. Some perfectionists, they feel like they're being scrutinized. They feel like everyone knows every detail and are quick to make some form of judgment on them. So they feel embarrassed. They feel like they're transparent. People can see all their faults. So that's another aspect of perfectionism. Conditional worth, not be happy if they're not successful. So in some perfectionist minds, they feel like they have to be successful to have a sense of self-worth, though the two are linked together. Of course, fear of failure. If I avoid it, I don't need to deal with the consequences of failing. So some perfectionists, they don't even bother to try because it's they don't like to fail. They look very different than the ones that are striving. So there's also extreme perfectionists. They feel like if they do something, they have to do it extremely well and impressive. And so, for example, grad students, they feel like if they design a research study, it has to be something so unique that would be able to change the world or win the Nobel Prize or be published in the first try. And they work to impress others. I have to admit, I was kind of one of those people when I was in grad school and working on my research proposal. I lost a lot of sleep. I feel like I couldn't come up with a unique study that could make a significant contribution to the literature. And my wife said something that I thought was helpful. She said, "You're in grad school. You're here to learn. You're not here to perform and impress the professors." I think that was helpful for me to change my mindset from trying to impress into trying to improve and learn. So now I'm going to talk about how to identify perfectionists. So if you're working in a clinical setting, you're working with patients, working with a client, here's some of the things if they're setting unrealistic high standards or often feel like good is not good enough. See if they procrastinate. They have difficulty starting projects. See if they're very precise and detail oriented and have a strong need to do things right and are very rigid. Or they might be self-critical. They magnify their errors and failures. And they may be very deflated after setbacks because their self-worth is tied to their performance. Or they may have all or nothing thinking, a dichotomous way of thinking. Even slight imperfection, they feel like they're a failure. Or they have difficulties making decisions. They need affirmation from others, or they keep thinking over and over and ruminate. And in terms of assessing perfectionism, these are certain domains to look at or different dimensions to pay attention to. Look at what triggers. Are there certain cues that leads to perfectionism? Observe the behaviors that they have that are manifested by perfectionism. Examine their cognitive thoughts. Look at their environment, how what kind of setting they're in, how they're impacted by that. Also, examine the domains of their perfectionism, whether it's related to cleanliness, related to social relationships, body image, etc., or performance. And also pay attention to the severity and the impact of their perfectionism. Perfectionism is not all bad. So pay attention to see if it has a negative or positive impact on their well-being. So I'm going to show you some of the thinking styles that perfectionists have, and then I'll use some examples to illustrate. So perfectionists, some have selective attention. They focus on the negative. They focus on the parts that they don't do well. They have double standards. They have very high standards for themselves, while they don't have high standards for others. Some overgeneralize. If they're not good in one aspect, they feel like a total failure. They don't see it in an objective way. There's a lot of shoulds and must statements that lead to a lot of pressure. Perfectionists also tend to catastrophize. They think the worst. They feel like a mistake, the world's falling apart. Perfectionists also tend to feel like they mind read. They feel like they know others and they're always critical. They're always judging me. They're always scrutinizing me. Also, perfectionists feel like they can predict certain outcomes, and usually those outcomes are negative. Perfectionists have dichotomous thinking. It's all or nothing. So I'm going to use some examples to illustrate. So selective attention. How do you identify if someone has selective attention? So these are some of the questions that you can ask as a counselor. When you think about your performance, what do you tend to focus on? Do you notice more about your mistakes? How do you view the positive aspects of your performance? Do you tend to take them for granted? Do you discount your goals as too easy if you meet them? A lot of perfectionists do that. And once they met their goals, they set a higher goal. So it's a moving post that they never reach, and it can be very tiring. How do we challenge selective attention? So ways to ask or address this with clients is like you can ask, what do focusing on mistakes and discounting success do to your mood? So ask about the impact that this kind of tendency has on their mood. How do you think of a friend who would feel like if you constantly pointed out their mistakes and ignored their success? If you direct them to see if you did this to your friend, how would they feel? Double standards is another mindset or thinking pattern. So here are some ways to identify double standards. Do you have a set of standards for yourself and then another set for others? And are the standards for yourself higher than for those for others? Ask them to see if it's fair to have higher standards for themselves. What's the logic behind them doing so? And then again, project it on a friend. What would you say to a friend who had a harder set of standards for themselves than for others? Overgeneralizing is another thinking pattern. So a question that you can ask is, what do you think of yourself overall when you make a small mistake? Do you feel like you're a total failure and generalize it? How do you feel about yourself when you don't meet your standards? And then to challenge it, you can ask them, how do people define failure? And how would you compare yourself to that definition? So when you ask about people, others, you ask for a more general objective definition, and then ask them to compare their definition with others. And how does judging your worth based on a mistake function for you? How does it impact your mood? How does it impact your self-esteem? Identifying should statements. So a lot of perfectionists, they said they have to do this, they should do this, they must do this. So that's the way they motivate themselves. They are very harsh and critical and rigid. And so you can ask them to identify how they motivate themselves and see if the should statements come out. And ask them, how often do you say should or must when you think about the things that you have to do? So the goal is to encourage them to be a little bit more flexible. So ask them, how does this should make them feel? Do they feel like a failure? because they have to do it and they don't do it? Do they feel bad? Do they feel defeated? Or do they feel depressed? And also put it on a friend. Consider a friend wanting to exercise. What do you think if they say they have to exercise 7 days a week? That probably sounds pretty intense, pretty rigid because they must. What would it be if you can say, like, I would like to work more regularly if I can, to allow some flexibility, see if that's something that they can adapt, or is it okay for them? Last one, catastrophic thinking. When you think of the worst. And so this is an example. A counselor might ask, what do you think could happen as a result of your presentation? The client is having a presentation coming up and the client's very nervous. So the client, Tim, says the company would lose the client 5%. Bad. The counselor asks, what if that happened? What would be the worst thing about it? Tim says, I might lose my job. If that were true, what do you think would be the worst outcome? And then Tim says, I might not find another job and our family will starve. And the counselor says, to have that image in your mind is quite scary. Yes. And Tim said, yes, all the time. I feel like a failure, a loser. And they tend to think of the worst, and it could be very stressful and very anxiety provoking. So that's how to explore catastrophizing thinking. I've worked with many perfectionistic clients, and I often ask this question. Okay, so they come in, they said they want to work on perfectionism. I said, okay, if I said hypothetically, I have this pill, this medicine, if I say I give it to you, your perfectionism will be gone. Will you take it? And most of my clients said no, they won't. It's too scary to let go of their perfectionism. That's what they've been holding on to. That's their motivation, their drive over the years. So they are not willing to give up their perfectionism. It's hard persuading perfectionist clients. The main approach, or the most helpful approach, like I sort of illustrate, is to help them be aware of perfectionism's negative impact. So rather than focusing on the perfectionism itself, which they think is good, is their fuel to drive and motivate them, focus on the negative impact that it has on them, the stress that it causes, the health issues, the high blood pressures, the lack of social balance or work-life balance. Focus on those to help them realize, yeah, I think to have a healthier life, I probably need to deal with my perfectionism. So that's the approach. I'm gonna also give a little bit, shed a little bit light on working with a perfectionistic client. There's research that says that it's hard to establish a working relationship with a perfectionist client. And why so? Because perfectionistic clients are very critical. They're critical of themselves, and they might be very critical of the therapist. And then it's hard to build a relationship with this kind of client when, they're very doubtful, cynical, critical, and then it leads to a bad outcome. And then the bad outcome makes them even more critical towards significant others. They project this critical image onto healthcare personnel, and the people feel like they're being tested or put on trial. So as a therapist, you feel like you're being challenged, you're stepping on eggshells, and then it impacts the therapeutic relationship. So I think my perfectionist clients, many don't last long. After a while, they drop out because they have high expectations and they tend to be pretty critical. So I'm going to illustrate and share some case examples. So if you're watching online, you can feel free to pause and then think through some of these cases, write some of your thoughts down, and then move on. And then I'll give you some of the insights or answers. So I'm going to share about this client that I had, which was a typical perfectionist. So this client, she was a professional. She was hardworking. She came to me because she had just resigned from her job. She took an easier job because the former job was too stressful for her. And then because of doing so, she felt like a failure. So I talked with her, asked her about her situation. So I asked how she felt, and she said she feels like she's not good enough. She's constantly needing to catch up with others. And I asked her about, okay, so over the several years, how have you been in your company? And she said she received multiple promotions and raises, but she feels like she's not deserving to be promoted. She feels like somehow I don't know, they got it wrong. So she thinks that she's not good enough. So, and then I asked her, how do you do in your job? And then she focuses on the job duties, selective attention on the job duties that she's not her strength, that she's not really, that's not her main responsibility, and focus on the weaknesses and keeps talking about like she's not good. But those are not the main things that her job entails. And then she also feels like she needs to give 100%, or else she's a failure. And I asked her, how do you feel about the amount of effort that she gives in? And she says, I only gives about 75%. And she feels like because of that, she's a burden to all the coworkers. So she also feels guilty to other coworkers. And then when she came to me, she felt like a failure, that she couldn't take on the stress. So she resigned from her job. So I talked about her job, and it was a very good job, a prestigious job. And she graduated from a prestigious university. And when I talked about like, yeah, you got this good job, she said, no, that's just because of my family reputation, my father and stuff. So she felt like an imposter, like she wasn't good enough, and that people were gonna tell that she was didn't deserve the job. She was a failure, despite getting multiple raises and multiple promotions. And she didn't know how to achieve work-life balance. She just worked really, really hard. And she had a husband who was very different from her. And then she felt like her husband relaxed and played video games, and she was very critical and felt like he's just wasting his intelligence. And so that's how her other oriented perfectionism came out towards her husband. So this was my case. So I saw her for I think 2, 3 sessions, and then she kept canceling. And then the night before, because she had meetings pop up and stuff, but eventually stopped coming. But at the end, she went back to her old job. She resigned, took an easier job, felt like a failure, but after a few sessions, she decided to go back to her own job. So despite we didn't continue for long, but I think I maybe did make an impact. I helped her realize that despite feeling stressful, resigning from the job, but I think that was more meaningful for her. So she went back to the old job. And I want you to think, what perfectionistic thinking styles you see in this case? Because we talked about different thinking styles like overgeneralization, selective attention, etc. So think about what kind of styles do you see in this line. You can write it down. You can go back to the slide and look at it, and then I'll share with you. So these are a few that I identified. It's not like precise. You could come up with others, could also make sense, but selective attention, she had double standards for herself versus others. There was a lot of discrepancy looking at where she's not good enough. And then there was a lot of mind reading. Felt like she was a burden to others, or others, you know, got it wrong, or it's about reputation and stuff. Explained a lot of things to just explain away the positive aspects that she has and to persuade herself that she's never good enough. So this was another case, an African American. And he also had some perfectionistic tendencies, but this was in a different realm. So this was a longer term client. I saw him for several years. And so he was looking for a job. And then the job, there was a group interview. So it was not just one-on-one, but like multiple, like 5, 6 people applying for the job. They were all in this one room, sitting in a desk, being interviewed together. And somehow he just felt like all the other interviewees, all the other applicants were looking at him, paying attention. So he got a little bit nervous. And he was asked a question. He responded. He focused on the nervous aspects of when he was responding. He projected and thought, everyone must think I'm a weak person. And because he felt like everyone thought he was a weak person, he became even more anxious. And then he just, in contrast, felt like everyone's so calm and confident and just singled himself out and like, I'm the only one that's weak and anxious. And then felt very, very nervous, anxious, and then bad in the situation. And then later on, someone sitting beside him just asked him a little question. Um, I don't remember what it was, but I think it was just a very minor thing. And because they did that, he thought they were asking him the question to calm him down because they saw him as a nervous and weak person. So he really struggled because he felt like he showed his weakness, which made him even more nervous. And then this became a maladaptive perfectionistic cycle. So I'll pause a few seconds. You can pause your screen if you want to think through what kind of perfectionistic thinking patterns or characteristics or tendencies you identify in this client. I will show you some of the things I connected it with. There was selective attention. He focused on certain aspects of his weakness. There was double standards. He just viewed people differently, better. He overgeneralized one aspect to his whole self. And then there's catastrophizing, thinking the worst, and then thinking worse, worse, worse. And then a lot of mind reading, thinking they must think this of me, they must think I'm weak, and then the dichotomous thinking, all or nothing. And then so there's a pattern between feeling nervous and then got anxious and then felt like he was perceived as weak and trying to hide that weakness, and then it just became a cycle. So how did I deal with him in this situation? So as we were talking about this, first I pointed out the perfectionistic characters that I saw in him, the different thinking patterns. I described the maladaptive cycle, that he felt a little bit nervous and then he got anxious about feeling nervous and then felt like others were observing him, and then others saw that he was a weak person and he tried harder to hide the weaknesses but felt like he couldn't, and he got more nervous. It became a cycle. And then I asked them, is it okay to be weak or to just be yourself? And then we talked about why was it important for him to hide his weakness. And then we got to a deeper level, and we realized that growing up he was bullied by others. And then as a minority, as an African American, his mom advised him to, the way to counter your bully is never show your weakness, or else people will bully you more. So you have to be tough. So that has always been instilled in his mind, that he needs to be presented strong. And then there's certain times because he can't, or he feels like others thinks he's weak, and then it will just catch him off guard, and he'll just be anxious and flustered and can't manage. So learning how to accept some weakness would probably be some of his work to do, and unpacking the trauma of being bullied. Okay, I'll show you another case example. This was with a client that I saw, I think for several sessions, maybe 5 to 10 sessions. So this was also an incident that was mentioned with this client. He was typical perfectionist. So we would go back and forth between what he thinks, and then he would counter with what I think and stuff. So this was one of the typical examples where I thought, I can't argue with him. He's too smart. So I think the important part would be to focus on the impact that perfectionism has on him. So this person, it's more related to social. He felt like he needed to be nice to everyone. So he suppressed his own personality, his desires, so that he can please others. And when others commented on him having a good personality, something that he's working very hard to do, he takes it for granted. However, if someone's slightly cold, he feels like it's his responsibility he did something wrong. And in addition to that, he's so you think, okay, he just can be really nice to people. So that should be his goal. But he said, no, he can't be too nice to people. If he's too nice, people will think he's not genuine enough. So there's only that slight window that's nice, but not too nice, the perfectly nice that he can be. So that's really challenging. So, and then in addition to that, because he feels responsible for others' feelings, it somehow he has this illusional belief that his attitude, his personality, how he engages with others should be able to melt others' negative emotions regardless. So others shouldn't have negative emotions. If they did, it was his fault. So once he came to me and said that the coworker that he was working with seemed to be cold recently, and he felt like it was his fault. And he was very bothered by it. And he was trying to figure out how to solve it. But after a few weeks, he told me that the coworker is friendly now. They seem to be happy. I said, okay, well, so you must have done something or repaired that relationship. But no, he attributed it to, no, I think she just has a boyfriend now. So she's happy, she's in love. And then so the good is not his credit, and the bad is always his fault. So this was how perfectionism impacted how he saw himself socially. So these are some of the characteristics that are associated with this client that I came up with. So there was some selective attention, double standards for himself versus others, a lot of must and should, and also mind thinking, mind reading, feel like he knew what was going on in other people's minds. So how did I help him, or how did we address this in this section? So I pointed out the different layers of scrutinizing himself, the different layers of needing to be perfect in the interpersonal relationship. I also described that, okay, interpersonally, it's really hard to be you because there's only that small, very small perfectionistic window of being nice. You can't be too nice, but you have to be very nice. You have to be able to melt everyone's negative emotions, or else it's your fault. It's your responsibility. I also highlight how he attributed the double standards. If people's not happy, it's his fault. If people's happy, it's other reasons. And we also talked about how he can't be himself and he has to please others. And then we talked about his desire to be free, to be relaxed, and to just be himself, rather to be very cautious and step on like feeling like he's stepping on eggshells. So we talked about being himself or learning how to be himself involves taking some risk and then finding the tipping point. So in other words, you'll have to find out at what point will you offend someone? At what point will you do something wrong? Then you know the tipping point, or else you're just going to be very safe in being this nice. And it won't allow you to be yourself. So in other words, I encourage him to embrace some mistakes as opportunity to learn how to grow interpersonally and learn how to be more of himself freely. Yeah, back to the theme of what we talked about in terms of the perfectionism dimensions. It's important and it's healthy to strive for perfection. That's not something we need to address with clients. I'm not telling them that they need to lower their standards. They can't strive for excellence, but instead it's helping them deal with the discomfort of imperfection, helping them embrace mistakes, helping them allow themselves to be themselves, take some risks. One last example, this will be short. So this person came from a very rich family. His family donated buildings and had big companies, so he didn't really have to work. But he felt bad about the privileges and the wealth that he had. So his perfectionism was different. It wasn't about achieving, but it was about having daily routines to keep him busy, to feel like he was productive. So this was more of a process-oriented mindset that interacted with perfectionism. He didn't care much about the outcome, but he focused on a perfect effort or plan. He rented an office space to go there and work every day and had a lot of things on his schedule, but he didn't have any goals or outcome. But he just wanted to feel like he's not a lazy person because he was rich. There's a lot of should and must in his statements. And then there's this perfect effort, not about the outcome, but the perfect effort that he has to work hard, even though there's no goals about working hard. So this was a unique perfectionistic client that I saw. So if you have time, of course, you can pause now and think about your cases. Do you have any cases that are perfectionists? If so, which perfectionistic thinking styles you see in your case? Are they any ones below? So we'll go to the last part where I'll talk about how to help perfectionists. Let me start off with kind of summarizing. So we did a lot about the research, about the framework, and a lot of different studies, case examples, but I kind of want to summarize some of the underlying factors of perfectionism. I think to sort of have this summary will give us a sense of how to tailor our interventions towards perfectionists. So perfectionists, a lot deal with self-image. So their view of self, their self-image is unstable. Sometimes it's good, a lot of times it's bad. And they focus a lot on their inadequacies. So they often feel like they're an imposter, they're not good enough. So that's what's fueling them to work, to perform, to achieve certain ways that people can see them. So they seek external validation. So they need others' approval. Or it could be approval from their grades, from their performance reviews, from different things, achievements. So this is their self-image. They need approval and it's unstable. And because of that, there's this fear. Because their self-image, their worth is tied with their performance, there's this fear of failure, and also there's this fear of rejection, work rejection, rejection from people. And for some perfectionists, there's also a fear of success. This may sound weird, but some people, when they achieve success, they're not happy. They just feel like, now I need to work on something really harder. Or because I succeeded, people are going to have this expectation or image of me. So I'll need to work really hard to maintain this level of success. So sometimes they don't want to succeed because it'll give them more pressure. So there are some perfectionists, they kind of hide under the radar. They can do this, but they don't because they feel like if they do that, then others will hold them at that level and then they'll be more stressed. So there's different types of perfectionists. So not only fear about failure, but also some fearing success. And perfectionists, they tend to compare because their self-worth, self-image is tied to their performance, tied to external validation. So they kind of compare. And of course, perfectionists, they always look up, look at the higher. So there's upward social comparison. They'll compare with people who are better. And I think social media can be quite toxic when there's unlimited number of people, number of accomplishments, number of experiences, leisure activities that we can compare ourselves with. So if we get into that loop, and for perfectionists or just for people, I can kind of guarantee if you go into that comparison loop, 80% of the time, you're going to end up feeling depressed. because you're always going to find people that are better than you, that are living a more exciting life than you. So social comparison is a challenge for perfectionists. And then one last thing, I think it's key. I probably don't have a lot of slides on this, but emotions is key. I think the thing that causes stress is the emotions, the anxiety, the inability to tolerate uncertainty, and the shame that's related to the way they compare themselves or the way they see failure. So addressing emotions is very important for perfectionists. And in terms of being a therapist, I know you probably have different approaches. Some people are CBT, focus on cognitive and behavior. Some people are humanistic. They focus on unconditional positive regard and acceptance. Some people are psychodynamic. They focus on looking into your past, into your unconscious, looking at your family and how the attachment and stuff. And then some people might be family systems, looking at the environment, how they impact you. So there's different lenses, different ways to help perfectionists. And we talked about perfectionism can come from settings, can come from families. Perfectionism, there's a lot of cognitive thinking, different thinking patterns. And also perfectionists, they don't have a stable self-worth. So unconditional positive regard is important. So it can be a combination of different ways that you can approach it or something that aligns with your view. I'm just gonna share a few more slides to illustrate or present some image of ways that I help people with perfectionism. So we talked about discrepancy. So the discrepancy is looking at the inadequacy, the imperfection, and criticizing themselves. So a lot of times after talking with a perfectionist, I kind of address that there seems to be an inner critic in you that are often criticizing you. In social settings, it might say you're boring. The other person might not want to talk to you. What should you ask next? And then in performances, it might say you're not good enough, you're a fraud, you don't deserve this, certain things. And then it's so disturbing. You just want to shut it off. So we pay attention to inner critic, and then I encourage them to kind of mentally turn off or turn low the volume. I think it's impossible to totally get rid of it. But I think being aware of, okay, there's that inner critic again, that's being very critical, that's disturbing me, that's distracting my focus on interacting with this person in the social setting. Being aware of it will help turn the volume down. So I encourage them to be aware of their inner critic and then to realize that the inner critic is a disruption, is not helping them. And then we talked about mental flexibility. So we talked about the shoulds and the musts. I think if we say this should happen and we're very rigid about certain outcome and use that outcome to define who we are and our self-worth, it's very stressful and we'll be very nervous. We'll feel unsafe. We'll feel like very tense. So I encourage them to create mental flexibility, allow different outcomes to unfold, and allow yourself to adjust to different outcomes. And then also, if you're in a state of a good situation, to understand that this is temporary. Good things will come, good things will pass. And if you're in a state of struggles, also understand that the bad situation will also go away, or the emotional cloud will go away. So allow for mental flexibility. So that's one thing that I encourage them. And then I tell them mental flexibility, it's like physical stretching. Be flexible. We need to stretch. We can't just be flexible all at once. Mentally, we also learned how to stretch. And certain challenges in life are like workout sessions for us to practice stretching our mental ability. So for sometimes, like I do that too. What I do is I have on my cell phone, I have a list, a note, and life is messy. And so whenever I encounter a setback or encounter something that's frustrating, I put it into my um, life is messy note and remind me that, okay, I'm ruminating, I can't tolerate this, but I'm gonna download that onto my cell phone so I don't ruminate as much in my head. And also, a lot of times when we're worried, it's because we have a fear. We're afraid that something bad will happen if we don't attend to it. So if I put it in my cell phone, I won't forget. It's there. I can go back and look at it. And then thirdly, I put it on my cell phone. It's kind of like I go for a run. I know some people on their Apple Watches, on their cell phones, they like to record their exercise. Like I run for this many minutes, or I have this many steps. So it's like mentally, I did an exercise, a stretching around accepting life's imperfection, life's messiness. So I kind of log it. And then after periodically, I go back and look. And then, especially on stress, I go back and look, oh, 5 months ago, I experienced that. It turned out okay. Life still goes on. Oh, 2 months ago, this happened. And what helps me develop my resiliency and my mental flexibility. Well, I think that's a concrete way that I kind of utilize to help me. And in terms of talking about mental flexibility, this is a parable, a story in the Chinese culture. In Chinese, it's called 塞翁失马,焉知非福. To translate that into English, it's about a person who lost a horse. And then whether that's a curse or a blessing, you don't know. So this is how the story goes. So this person, his horse got stolen. So usually when our horse gets stolen, we feel like it's a curse. It's something really bad that happened. But afterwards, they found the horse. So then he's happy. Okay, a bad thing turned good. But then his son was riding on the horse and then fell off the horse and broke his leg. And then, wow, okay. So getting the horse back wasn't a blessing. It was a curse. Something bad happened to the son. But then, after a few months, a war happened. So they were drafting people, young men, to go into the war. But because the son broke his leg and is healing, they don't need to go to the war. So now, breaking the leg, it's kind of like a blessing, not so much a curse. So it's an example of sometimes we can't predict the future. And something that looks like a curse can be a blessing. Something to look like a blessing can be a curse, and to allow for mental flexibility and let the future unfold. I think this is a good parable example for mental flexibility, especially for those who have. We also talked about discrepancy, focusing on the imperfection, and that kind of can be detrimental to our self-view, to our mental health. And so this glass half full, half empty, there's different ways of looking at it. If you constantly look at what you don't have, it's challenging. It's not good. You don't feel good about yourself. You feel like you're bad if you just magnify that and keep looking at the empty part. So pay attention to the part that you have. Cultivate the attitude of gratitude, being grateful, and focus on your strength and positive aspects, not just your weakness. And I can give you an example of me when I'm perfectionistic, and I'm growing, I'm recovering, so I'm not like this anymore. So in the past, when I started teaching, like if I have a class of 30 students, and then most of them are engaging and listening, but there's two that are nodding and dozing off, and I feel like I'm a very bad teacher. I feel like, how can I not engage those two? I magnify those two to define my lecture and my teaching. I neglect the 28 that are engaging, asking questions. And that selective attention to the empty part can be very detrimental and can cause a low self-esteem in my view of teaching. Of course, I go to my wife and talk to her again. And she gave me a wise um, comment. She said, "You're a teacher. You're there to teach. You're not a comedian. You don't need to everyone to be laughing and super engaged. And as long as they're growing, they're learning, they're becoming the therapist that they should become, you did your job. So don't worry. about entertaining everyone. And of course, sometimes when people nod, it could be because they have jet lag. It could be because they had a fight with their boyfriend last night and they didn't sleep. So a lot of things. So allow ourselves to focus with a more balanced view. I think for perfectionists, we're always looking ahead and wanting to do a lot, want to be very efficient, pack a lot of things into our lives. And we often don't tend to the little things or be mindful about how we feel and our surroundings. So this was at Banff National Park in Canada. It's one of the more beautiful places that I've been to. And then on that day when I was there, I had a flare up on my knee, so I couldn't walk. So my family went out to walk, so I just sat there because I couldn't walk. I was on crutches. So as I was sitting there, I was just taking videos, and I took two videos. One was a fast pace of the water, the scenery, and which is how I feel in my life in the usual time. So I will play this. So this is what it looked like. That's how I feel. I don't remember a lot. I just see people come and go, water flow, and just go about my life in this way. I don't really pay much attention to what's happening. Life goes by fast. Sometimes I forget what happened the next day. A lot of times people ask me, how was your weekend? What did you do? Oh, I forgot. This is going through life in a fast pace. I took another video. This is going through life with a mindful sense of our surroundings. I think when things are slow, we can't become attentive. This is how the wave kind of flows, and this is how the water, it keeps going. And sometimes I might see a leaf in 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 the river and see how it flows, and imagine myself. So I think it would be important for perfectionists sometimes to slow down and be mindful, because our mind are often running 100 kilometers an hour, and sometimes we can take it slow and using a walking pace to um, pay attention to our surroundings. Another thing that I try to do for myself or help others with perfectionists is to accept the messiness of life. Sometimes life is like this. This is probably better than pure messiness, but it's just a lot of distracting things. It is hard to tolerate, especially sometimes when our mind spins like this and our face is dirty. So I think tolerating, like, life is messy, life is not perfect. There's certain setbacks that will happen. People are not easy to handle. So be aware, be prepared, and of course, do mental workouts to increase our tolerance. Messiness is important to deal with perfectionism. Um, Another aspect is finding the tipping point. I'll share a story. So I started to learn how to rollerblade when I was about 25 years old. So I wasn't like a little kid that could fall and stuff. I was an adult. I didn't like falling anymore. So I learned how to rollerblade. Okay, so I was rollerblading and I realized I got to a point that I wouldn't fall. So I would just rollerblade safely in circles so I won't fall. But then one day I realized some people could do really fancy stuff that I can't. And I realized they can tilt to a certain point that I never dare myself to do that. And one thing I learned from it is that in order to find the tipping point, in order to find the angle that I can tip to rollerblade, I need to allow myself to fall. Or else I won't know the tipping point. I'll always be playing it safe like this rather than going like this fast and stuff. So falling and failing is important. So there's a Chinese saying that is like, failure is the mother of success. So it's through failures that we learn and improve that ultimately takes us to succeed, success. So mistakes Success is built upon mistakes. So we're going to miss the target, allow ourselves to miss the target. Don't worry too much about it. Just do it again, practice, allow ourselves. And then I think the more we're able to allow ourselves to make mistakes, we'll be more resilient making mistakes. We'll be more able to tolerate mistakes. And in other words, it's accepting imperfection. So this is a clay that's not perfectly made. And then there's, paint over. So being able to accept imperfection is the path to become a more perfect person. So this is what I tell my clients, my patients. I tell them that you strive for perfection. You want to be a more perfect person. But your goal, or the part that's not good enough now, is your inability to accept mistake and imperfection. So if you build the mental muscle to accept imperfection, you'll be a more well-rounded and better person. So I encourage them. So it's paradoxical. So they want to be perfect, but I think to be a better person, they need to build their ability to accept imperfection. And then in other words, then if something bad happens, if they make a mistake, it becomes an opportunity for them to go through a mental workout, like to become more resilient to accepting perfection, to accept imperfection. So in other words, like if we want to lose weight or build muscles, we need to go exercise. We need to go to the gym. It's not just thinking that, oh, I need to exercise. That won't work. We have to actually exercise. So in other words, to be better at accepting mistakes, accepting imperfection, we have to encounter and embrace mistakes and imperfection. So what I tell them is the next time you make a mistake, rather than say, oh, why did I make a mistake and be defeated? Tell yourself, oh, I got an opportunity to exercise my mental capacity to accept and tolerate mistakes. So embrace mistakes. Mistakes is not bad. It's something that's going to help you grow. And so I don't know if you know about the concept of Kinzuki. So this is something that I learned from my clients, one client. So he taught me that there's this art of repairing ceramics using the gold glue when you mend them together. So for example, in the past, when a pottery broke and I really wanted to keep it, I will try to glue it as good as possible so I can't see the cracks. So it looked as close to new as possible. But instead, this philosophy is that these cracks are part of the history of this bowl. So rather than hide the imperfection, embrace our imperfection, our mistakes, our brokenness. That's part of what has the experiences that has shaped us to become who we are. So I got really into this idea of Kinzuki. I think by highlighting the cracks, they're beautiful. And it helps me remind myself that my goal is to embrace imperfection, to accept my mistakes, accept my brokenness. And I got into doing Kinzukis. So I make them now. So with the visual, it's hard to show you. So I make these now. And I've enjoyed doing it. And to the point, I just like the process. And I think when something bad, I just crack a bowl. It's like, and then I put it together. I crack it to let out my emotions. And then so like breaking things feels good when you're not in a good mood. And then I force myself to sit there for an hour to put it together and to sit with my negative emotions. So I'm learning to tolerate, sit with my emotions as opposed to avoid them, embrace them, avoid them, distract myself from them. And so I'm building my mental muscles to tolerate imperfection. So I really enjoy doing it. And then to the point, my wife said, why are you making so many of these? Where are we going to put them? We don't have a big house. And then I started selling them, whereas it's an online market where you can sell them. So it's been a very good healing and coping way of art for me. in terms of learning how to accept imperfection?
So one important thing about perfectionism or helping perfectionists is to help them emphasize the progress. Help them see the progress that they've made. Sometimes they'll want to go from 0 to 100 and then feel like, oh, I'm not there yet. But then instead of looking at how much more you need to go, help your clients or help yourself to think about, okay, how do you compare to yourself 3 months ago, a year ago? And then you realize I've been making progress. I've been making improvements. And that's important. So, for example, people who are perfectionists want to be able to overcome their emotions immediately, want to be able to not feel anxious, overcome anxiety. And then instead of not feeling anxiety at all, I kind of ask them, okay, so compared to 6 months ago, what has it been like in terms of dealing with the situation? And then they might say, yeah, 6 months ago, a situation like this, I would be anxious for 2 days. And then now I'm only anxious for half a day. So that's a progress. Focus on the progress and the glass that's full as opposed to the glass that's empty. And also, this is another helpful illustration. I think typically perfectionists, we look at the achievement, the ways we're acknowledged, like being able to climb up to the top of the mountain. But a lot of times we ignore. Sometimes our situation are different. We have a lot of mental stress and challenges. So we're just climbing out of that ditch, out of that valley, even though we're just here. But we've made the progress of climbing up, especially with people who are already dealing with depressive mood, anxious mood, with their perfectionist tendencies. Help them realize they've accomplished a lot. Don't feel like you need to be on the mountain. You can celebrate even climbing out of the ditch. So this is the strength that we're taught to admire, but this is the strength that we should also admire. I think this applies to people dealing with mental health challenges. And like I mentioned, emotions, that's important. I think there's a lot of thinking, but sometimes we can think the right way, but we just can't tolerate our emotions. So I think it's important to know how to cope with emotions, to be able to understand our emotions, be able to use our emotions as a window to guide us into the roots of our problems. Don't judge our emotions, feel like we're weak because we're anxious or we're depressed. Instead, be compassionate and try to understand ourselves, and then be able to sit with emotions, but also diffuse. Don't be overwhelmed with the thoughts that that we have when we're clouded by our emotions, but instead know that I'm at an emotional state. I'm dealing with an emotional storm. I'm not thinking rationally, but they're not reality. And I'm gonna step back and just observe, but I'm not gonna believe in all the messages that it's telling me. It's telling me that I'm a failure, I'm worthless, I'm gonna be broke, I'm gonna lose my job, I'm gonna starve. But no, that's my emotions thinking. But distance myself and know that that's not the reality. But I can't all of a sudden shift into a happy mode, but I can observe and wait till the emotional cloud goes away. And after it goes away, I'll have more clarity. It's not the end of the world. I just need to improve this. I'm making progress and things like that. So I would say learning how to tolerate, how to sit with our emotions, but also diffuse our emotions, not get caught up in the negative catastrophizing thoughts. I think that's important because our emotions leads us to understand the roots of our issues, and also being able to tolerate emotions, then we won't be as scared. I think the reason that we're stress discomfort is that we can't tolerate our emotions. We can't tolerate the emotions that comes from mistakes and failures. So we talked about the different approaches. So in a nutshell, I think it's important to be able to accept who we are as ourselves, embrace who we are, be compassionate, It's also important to be aware of how we're thinking and the thinking patterns. It might not all of a sudden take away all the emotions. Sometimes we know how to think the right way, while our emotions aren't caught up yet. And then it's also embracing the opportunities for workout sessions through the mistakes, the failures, the setbacks. Those are what are going to make us more resilient and more stronger and a better person. And so to summarize, these are from Dweck, who wrote the book Mindset, Carol Dweck. These are some of the ways that she talked about working with perfectionists: challenging irrational beliefs, appreciate the drive to succeed, having a growth mindset, focusing on our growth, our improvement, unconditional acceptance, be compassionate, differentiate what's within or beyond our control, and to deal with procrastination, set priorities, break things down into manageable mini tasks, normalize failures, persist after initial failure, and the paradoxical mindset of embracing imperfection. Lastly, I'll show a few books that can be helpful around perfectionism. There's cognitive behavioral aspects, different books of perfectionism. And then the one that says nobody's perfect, that's a children's book. And in the past, when my daughter, she was about 8 years old, we identified some of perfectionistic tendencies. And then we read this book together. And some of the messages stuck. So there's times when she's trying to be perfect, and she'll remember nobody's perfect. And I think it was helpful in terms of at an early age, help her to embrace that it's okay to not be perfect. So this is my slides, and I'd be happy to answer or discuss any questions or hear about your comments. I think in May, and we'll all interact with you for about 30 minutes. So thank you for this opportunity for me to share about perfectionism with you. And I'm excited to meet you in person live.